Hey guys, in this video we are taking a look at chapter 20. You may have, if you've had a chance to look through the PowerPoints for chapter 20, you may notice that the PowerPoint is very short and sweet. Chapters 20 and 21 are very much going to go together today, as 20 talks about what's called the lymphatic system, and I'll get into that. In the lymphatic system, we talk about different parts of the body that are in our body to help us with defense, kind of very similar to how our white blood cells work. We're going to talk today about different organs and different cells that are part of the lymphatic system help to protect our body and to defend us. But more specifically in chapter 21, in the next video, we will get into our defense system, which we call our immune system. So I'll show you guys today and you'll see very much how those go together. So this one will start off kind of short and sweet. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at chapter 20. So you can see here we're looking at the lymphatic system. So there's a little bit different than the immune system itself. Your immune system is just that. It's just your defense system. In your lymphatic system, there's a couple other things going on. In your lymphatic system, which we'll see today, there are a couple different functions we'll take a look at. We'll talk about what lymph is. Our lymphatic system is actually going to look very similar to our blood system, to our circulatory system. It is composed of lots of different vessels, and those vessels very much work like our blood vessels. They pump a little bit differently, meaning how things circulate through our lymphatic system will work a little bit differently as it's not attached to the heart the way that our blood vessels are. So we'll see a little bit as far as the flow of lymph. So we'll talk about the composition of it and then how it moves. We'll take a look at what's called lymph nodes. It's one of the organs, or one of masses of tissue, I should say, in our lymphatic system that helps with, protecting us against different things. We'll take a look at the location of a couple different types of nodes, more importantly the cervical, axillary, and inguinal, but we'll take a look at some other locations of other nodes as well. And then we'll also talk about some other lymphoid organs called the tonsils. If you may or may not be familiar with our tonsils, and you also may or may not still have your tonsils. Some people have their tonsils removed, but we'll talk about what those are. We'll talk about the thymus gland again. Hopefully that's just a refresher from, again, our endocrine system chapter, but we'll talk again how it relates very much to our immune system again. So we'll see that again in this chapter, and we'll also describe the spleen. So what does our lymphatic system do? So there are three things. One, what happens is when our cells, and we know that our blood cells, our blood vessels are constantly delivering hormones and oxygen and nutrients all over our body. Remember how we talked about how our capillaries are the exchange vessels, and our capillaries are the most numerous because they're all over the body, because capillaries are constantly delivering oxygen to every single tissue in our entire body, so they're everywhere. So our capillaries are so thin-walled that things can exit the capillaries, even sometimes fluid that isn't being delivered to the tissues, and sometimes that fluid tends to sit in between our tissue cells, and we refer to that because it's sitting in between tissues. We use that term interstitial, which means it's just sitting in between the cells. It just kind of hangs out there. That fluid needs to be returned back to blood, and that's where the lymphatic system comes in. Its job is to return this fluid that's just been lost by our blood. It's going to return it back to the blood. Along the way, it will absorb fat and fat-soluble vitamins in our intestinal system, in our intestinal tract. It's also going to help to defend the body against infection. In that process of returning fluid back to the blood, we're going to help to filter that fluid out a little bit. I'll show you guys a better picture of this, but in the process of moving back to it, it's going to run into a lot of different places along the lymphatic system where we might be able to clean it out. Let me show you what I mean. So here just shows kind of a close-up view that shows here's our blood vessels. Here you can see the red and the blue and the capillaries represented in this picture here, and then this kind of pink or white in between, that's just the tissue. Again, capillaries are in the process of delivering oxygen and other nutrients to this said tissue, but nearby you can see there are lymphatic vessels and capillaries around as well. Lymphatic vessels, just very similar to blood vessels will work by, moving fluid throughout them. And they also have capillaries because it needs to be able to get into those lymphatic vessels. So those capillaries are very thin walled, just like a blood capillary. So again, what it's doing is this fluid that's being lost by blood, right at that same site, these lymphatic capillaries are going to pick it up. They're going to go ahead and grab it. And that's what lymph is. As it mentions here, it's a clear fluid that very similar resembles plasma. It is also composed mostly of water, but it also has electrolytes, waste from these metabolizing cells, and some protein that leaks out of the capillaries, out of that systemic circulation, so lymph is going to pick that up. It is formed from plasma during that capillary exchange. So it's, again, that's why it so closely resembles this plasma. It's just kind of lost fluid that it actually derives from plasma. Here's a better view to show kind of a brief overview of circulation. Obviously, there's a whole lot more capillaries than these two sets of capillaries that we have right here. But again, remember when we talked about circulation, here's the heart, and we talked about how blood is returning to the heart, but then needs to be pumped up to the capillaries in the lungs. Those lung capillaries, we'll see that exchange take place up there. They pick up oxygen and then come through over here to the left side of the heart, where that oxygen-rich blood is going to be pumped and goes to all the capillaries of our tissue. So again, this is just kind of a simplified picture of circulation. Well, in that process of exchange, again, sometimes that fluid is lost. So our lymphatic vessels are going to drain that fluid. They're going to take that fluid, and its job is to return right back to the veins that are closest to the heart. So you can see in this picture, the goal is to get all that fluid right here to that vein that's attached directly to the heart, because the idea of putting it there is when they're put right into veins, and remember, veins go towards the heart. So again, if that fluid is drained back into the blood system that way, then it's going to be pumped right into the heart and then pumped right into circulation. So it's being returned right back into that. So that's the job. Lymphatic vessels are going to drain that interstitial fluid. They are parallel to the veins, so they run, parallel, meaning just kind of right along the veins. And every organ in the body has a rich supply of lymphatic vessels, again, for that purpose, that when that fluid is lost, it's going to pick that up. And then, along the way, we're going to run into these things called lymph nodes. And those lymph nodes are filled with what we're going to talk about, lymphocytes and macrophages, which are two defense cells. They're going to help to clean it out and kind of act as filters as that lymph goes through this this pathway. These lymph nodes, will again be the filters that they run into along the way. So hopefully by the time we run back or get right back here to those veins, then that interstitial fluid, or that lymph, what we're calling it now, is completely cleaned out and ready to go right back into the blood. So what causes lymph to move? I'm going to show you guys a better overview of our lymphatic system. I do have a labeling sheet that's going to go with this chapter, and it's coming up in a couple slides. And I'll walk through it with you guys. And you can see kind of a better idea of all of the lymph vessels that are in our body. Again, but they're very, very close to pretty much all of our blood vessels all over our body. So every organ, we're seeing lymphatic vessels present. So we're going to see, that they're all over the place. But how does it move? As I mentioned real briefly in the introduction, that lymph doesn't move quite like blood does, because blood, we know, is attached to the heart, the vessels, I should say, are attached to the heart. And so the pumping action of the heart helps to pump blood, as well as the smooth muscle that surrounds things like our arteries. Remember, we talked about how the muscle in our arteries are so thick that it causes the pressure in arteries to be much greater. Lymph doesn't have that. So there's a couple different ways that lymph will move through our body. One, it's called the milking action of skeletal muscles, meaning that the more we move, the more lymph will move, because of, very similar to like when you're milking a cow, how it kind of, that pressure on the udder kind of helps to get that to move through. Very similarly, the pressure caused by different movements in our body will help to cause that pressure on the lymphatic vessels, causing lymph to move throughout our system. So that's why it mentions here that exercise is good. Again, the more we move, the more our lymph is going to move. And we want that lymph to be constantly moving, because the idea is to return it back to our blood. But in that process, cleaning it out. Now, that doesn't mean if we don't exercise that, we're never going to return our fluid back to the blood, because we also have other ways that this moves. Our chest during respiration, we know that when we breathe in and out, our chest is constantly moving up and down. The variations of pressure in our chest can also cause that lymph to move as well. The lymphatic vessels there were causing that pressure, therefore causing pressure for all of our lymphatic vessels. And then there is a little bit of smooth muscle in our lymphatic vessels, maybe not as much as like an artery, but the rhythmic contractions of the lymphatic smooth muscle will cause those vessel walls to contract and push lymph all throughout the pathway. So we're still seeing, movement even when we're not moving. But the more that we move, the more our lymph will move. So what happens is, and I'll show you again the overview picture. I probably should have put it before this. But what happens is all of our lymphatic vessels in the entire body will move towards, again, the idea is to return that fluid closest, right into the veins that are closest to the heart. So everything is going to be picked up by two collecting ducts. There are two ducts that will collect all of this lymph and then put it right into those veins. So we have two drainage areas. They're called the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Both ducts will drain into the subclavian veins, which are the veins right here in our chest, and then to the jugular veins as well. But you don't have to know that. Just know that it's going into veins in our chest, again, closest to the heart. The right lymphatic duct, and you'll see this again in that overview picture, only collects the fluid from the upper right side of the body. So it shows that this man here, you can see this kind of how he's colored in one picture here, or in one side here, and then the other, everything else is kind of black and white. And that is because the right lymphatic duct only collects the lymph from this area. So all of the lymphatic vessels are moving towards, from this side, are moving towards the right lymphatic duct. Everything else is collected by the thoracic duct. So everything from the upper left side of the body, as well as the entire lower half of the body, is moving. All the fluid from there is going towards the thoracic duct. And both of those, what their job is to collect all of that fluid and put it right into those veins. Again, I'll show you guys a better picture in just a second. We also have in our lymphatic system, we have different lymphoid organs. All along the pathway, we're going to see lymph nodes. I'll show you guys on that picture, I'll show you guys there are different collections of lymph nodes all over the entire body. There are different groups of them, but all throughout these pathways that lymphatic vessels are taking, they're going to run into these lymph nodes, and lymph nodes will do that. They act as extra filters along the way, and they're going to clean out that fluid, that lymph. We also have different masses of lymphatic tissue in our pharynx. So I should say our pharynx, which is our throat. We have different areas of our throat. And actually today, when we talk about respiration, I'm going to show you guys, you're actually going to label the two areas of tonsils. Again, some people as children may have been susceptible to tonsillitis or got a lot of strep throat infections when they were kids, and doctors may have said, let's just go ahead and take out their tonsils, because tonsils, when getting infected so much, can sometimes cause our throat to swell up, and sometimes cannot, with our throat swelling up, that can obviously obstruct our breathing. So tonsils are oftentimes, in that event, are oftentimes removed. And that is something that is more common in children because children recover quicker from a tonsillectomy. Adults have a harder time recovering from that type of surgery. So that is something that is typically not done as an adult. It is occasionally, but it's usually pretty rare. But our tonsils do just that as we are breathing things in and eating things that are taking in and we're going directly into the throat, we have areas where we've got just these masses of lymphatic tissue that are going to help to protect right away. Our thymus gland, remember we talked about how our thymus gland is going to be there, during childhood development. As we're growing and we're teaching our immune system how to function, thymus gland is producing a hormone called thymosin, and that thymosin is going to do that. It's helping to develop that immune system by helping to produce different types of lymphocytes. So that is also a very important lymphoid organ. Our spleen, we'll talk about that today, how our spleen helps to filter out different things out of the blood as well, and I'll show you guys how that works. And then we also have what's called MALT, our mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. In a lot of the submucosal layers in a lot of our organs, we have just tissue that's for the same purpose present to help to defend. So in our like salivary glands, in our stomach, in our intestines, we have specific called Peyer's patches in our intestines, but they're very similar to MALT here in that they are just areas of that lymphoid tissue ready to defend in that particular organ, in that particular area. So that's what that means. All right, so let's talk about a couple of these. So our lymph nodules and lymph nodes are very, very similar. All along the pathway of the lymphatic vessels, they're going to run into these lymph nodes. Lymph nodes have, as it mentions here, these two compartments. So lymph nodules, within the lymph nodes, they have these sinuses, and then within it, they also have these nodules. And these nodules contain two different really important cells, lymphocytes and macrophages. Lymphocytes we talked about in our when we talked about our white blood cells. If you remember, we talked about how lymphocytes are very important in our immune defenses. When we talk about our immune system in the next chapter, we'll talk about how what immunity means is our body's ability to recognize something that we've already been exposed to. For example, when I was a kid, I had the chickenpox. I was sick from it for a week or two and eventually recovered from it and was able to go back to school and go about my day. Because I've already had the chickenpox, if I ran into somebody at school who had the chickenpox again at that time, even now, if I run into somebody who has a chickenpox, which is not likely because there is a vaccine for it now, but if I ran into somebody who had the chickenpox now, I would not get it. And that is because even if that virus were to make its way into my body, that virus would go into my blood, and what would happen is my lymphocytes would recognize that. We will then immediately produce antibodies. Antibodies in response to it will then destroy it before it even has a chance in my body, because I am able to recognize it, and because I recognize it, I know what antibodies I need for it and can fight it off before I develop the first sign or symptom. And that happens with a lot of things. The more we're exposed to certain things, we can sometimes fight it off a little bit easier. Unfortunately, with things like the cold, because there's so many different strains, with the flu changes every year, so that's why we have to have a yearly flu vaccine. Unfortunately, you know, that's something that we can't always protect ourselves against. But again, once we have the vaccine, that's how that works. It's very similar, that we have that recognition of it, we can fight it off better. We'll get into that. But that's what our lymphocytes do, is they help us to recognize things and help us to develop that immunity to it. Macrophages are simply just larger versions of, if you guys remember the white blood cell called a monocyte. A monocyte was a phagocytic cell. Remember phagocytosis, as that term is right there. Phagocytosis, remember, is the type of cell that will eat a antigen or pathogen of some sort and destroy it. It ingests it, it digests it, and that's how it gets rid of it. That's what a macrophage does. It's just a bigger version of that type of cell. So what is happening as lymph is flowing through these lymph nodes, it's going to run directly into these two types of cells. And because of that, we're going to be able to, you know, hopefully filter out that lymph. But it's going to run into more lymph nodes all along the pathway. So this is happening in multiple, you know, places before it gets returned back to our blood. It's also going to run into some lymphatic or lymph sinuses. They are lymph-filled spaces. They're just spaces within the lymph nodes, and they help to kind of bathe those lymph nodules and help to nourish them and kind of get them ready for the job that they need to do. Not super important there. The main thing I want you guys to be familiar with is with these lymph nodes, definitely be familiar with the fact that they are all along the pathway of our lymph vessels, and that we're running into those, you know, those two cells, lymphocytes and macrophages, that are really important for the process of the destruction of any pathogen that might be in that lymph at the time. So these lymphatic vessels are going to drain most of the body. So here is kind of an overview picture of a lot of the lymph vessels in our body. You can see just like our circulatory system and our blood vessels that are all over the body too, they are just vessels throughout the body here. And they are returning that back to blood. All along the pathway of those, we see these tiny little balls that are our lymph nodes. We have three different, your PowerPoint here is kind of focusing on three groups called the cervical, the axillary, and the inguinal. And I'm going to show you, there's a different picture I'll show you on the next slide that kind of shows these nodes a little bit closer and a little bit better. They're everywhere. They're all over these lymph nodes, so that as lymph is flowing through the vessels, they're going to run into these nodes. But there are certain areas of the body where lymph nodes are more prominent, where they're grouped more so in these certain sections. Like for instance, in the neck region, there are a lot of lymph nodes present there. That's why a lot of times when you're sick, sometimes your doctor feels your neck like this, and you think, what the heck are you doing? They're feeling for those swollen lymph nodes. In the event of some type of infection, when your lymph nodes are actively trying to fight something off, your lymph nodes will swell up. And that is a great place to feel for that process taking place, because it's in that area so close to your skin there. So those are your cervical lymph nodes. You have a collection of lymph nodes in your underarm region. We know that term to be axillary. Remember that term from the beginning of class. And then hopefully this term is familiar too. Inguinal is the groin region. So there are certain masses of lymph nodes in the groin region. Let me show you a better picture. So this is your labeling diagram, and this kind of sums up and kind of puts up together a lot of the things that we were talking about. I like this picture so much because it not only shows all the different lymph vessels, it shows all of the nodes pretty clearly. Here you can see all those little balls all along the pathway of the lymph vessels. We're actually going to group a lot of those and name those specific groups of lymph nodes, more than just the three from the previous slide. I'll even give you guys some other ones too. And there will be terms that you're already familiar with. There are terms from the beginning, like abdominal and thoracic. So that'll be pretty easy. But what it also shows, all along this picture, you see these different arrows. These arrows are reminding us of where lymph is going. Remember, lymph flows in one direction. Everything is going towards the chest, because the idea, again, is to put it right back into blood. And how it's going to do that is put it right into the veins in our chest, and those veins will then put it right back into circulation. This picture also shows those two collecting ducts that we talked about, the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. You can see here in the chest area, those are what's collecting all this lymph, and you can see they're attached directly to these subclavian veins in our chest, and that's going to put it right back into circulation. So let's identify some of these things. So lymph vessels and capillaries are all over the entire body, but 1 and 2 are pointing to those just to show what they are. So number 1 is actually pointing to our lymphatic capillaries. So very similar to blood capillaries, they're just the smallest of our lymph vessels. So you can call them lymph capillaries or lymphatic capillaries. Either one is correct. And then number 2, those capillaries will then take that interstitial fluid, collect it. That's what collects it, because they're so thin-walled. And then eventually that what now becomes lymph will then flow into our lymph vessels. So number 2 are pointing out the lymph vessels. Even though you can see them all over the place, again, it's just showing that number 2. So either lymph vessels or lymphatic vessels. Okay. And number 3, you can also see these all over the place. These are pointing out the lymph nodes. So those are your lymph nodes. And now numbers 4 through 9, so the next couple points that we're going to identify are these groups of lymph nodes. So number 4 is one that we've already identified. In the neck region, you have your cervical lymph nodes. So that's cervical. And it is specifically the cervical nodes. So if you just want to call it cervical, that's okay. But cervical nodes is specifically what it's pointing to, not just the cervical region. Whereas number 5, we're pointing out the axillary nodes there. So remember, there are lymph nodes we talked about in your underarm region. So those are your axillary nodes. Now, number 6, there are lymph nodes that are located in our chest region. Different books refer to these different ways. I know in an old book, and I'll have to look to see what your all's book, I don't have it with me right now. Your all's book, some books refer to that as just thoracic lymph nodes. Some books refer to that as the mediastinal lymph nodes. We're actually going to label in our respiratory system today, we'll talk about how the center of the chest region, I know that our chest region we identified as the thoracic cavity, but just the middle of that, where your heart is located, where your trachea is going to pass through, we call that the mediastinum. It's just the center of the chest region. So these lymph nodes are referred to as mediastinal for that reason, because they're located in the center of the chest. So I tell you what, if you guys call these thoracic nodes or mediastinal nodes, both will be correct. So just a heads up on that one. But that's number 6. Now, number 7 and 8, so sometimes these are tough because it's hard to really tell, without the intestines present. There are lymph nodes present in the intestinal region, so those are given a different name, but we're going to name these just how we know these. So we're going to call these the abdominal and pelvic lymph nodes because it's just easier. We know these terms. So number 7, those are the abdominal nodes. Number 8 are the pelvic nodes. But even lower, number 9, those are those inguinal nodes. So again, specifically, definitely be familiar with the 3 from the previous slide. On that, previous slide we talked about cervical, axillary, and inguinal, which was number 4, 5, and 9. But definitely, I would say be familiar with those as we, want to know where those are. So again, hopefully those are familiar terms to us, as we just labeled them according to those cavities that we learned day 1. So if you call this thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic, that is totally fine. There are just lymph nodes in lots of different areas because those areas sometimes see, more activity, more of, where we're needing more flow of lymph right there. So we're needing more assistance with trying to filter that lymph out. So that's what we're seeing there. And again, all of this lymph is flowing towards the chest. All of this lymph is going to be collected by one of 2 ducts. And so that picture down in the bottom right-hand corner, you guys can see the yellow is where the right lymphatic duct is going to collect. So number 10 is pointing out that right lymphatic duct. And then number 11, everything else in the body is collected by the thoracic duct. And so these 2 points point that out for us here. That area drained by the right lymphatic duct is shown in yellow. The area drained by the thoracic duct is shown in pink. So you can see the thoracic duct is a little bit larger. Okay. And then again, these are attached directly to these veins in the chest. So number 12, you can just call veins. If you call them subclavian veins, that's totally fine. But if you just call them veins, that's all we really need here. Because we know veins are going to go towards the heart, which therefore then are going to be put right back into the heart and then right back into circulation. Okay. So that is our lymphatic system. So again, I like that picture because it's a little bit more detailed and it shows exactly what I mean on how this fluid is going to be picked up all over the body. And wherever it's picked up, that's okay. It's absorbed by those lymphatic capillaries, will then flow through these lymph vessels all along the pathway. Even down here in the leg, you can see these are specifically the popliteal lymph nodes. You guys don't need to know that. But even down here, even if lymph is picked up down here, it's going to flow into these lymph nodes along that pathway, probably run up and maybe run into more lymph nodes before it reaches the chest. So those lymph nodes will, again, because of the presence of lymphocytes and macrophages, it's going to try to filter that out before it's returned either to the right lymphatic duct or to the thoracic duct. And here also is a great area to show where the spleen is located, and we're getting ready to talk about that. All right, let's talk about some of our different organs. So besides our lymph nodes, our other important lymphoid organs, we have the thymus gland. Remember, that is important in not really present in adults or active in adults. It starts to atrophy. So it assists in the development of the immune system before puberty even begins. It secretes the hormone thymosin. What that thymosin does is it helps to produce what's called T cells, and we'll talk more about those in the next chapter. Those are specifically lymphocytes. Remember, our lymphocytes are what helps us to remember. It's what helps our body to remember certain pathogens that we've been exposed to, so that we can fight it off better the next time around. And so that's what that's what that thymosin is doing, is it's helping to produce those lymphocytes in order for us to develop that immune system. So that's why the thymus gland is so important in childhood development. In fact, I read that long time ago, when scientists were studying the thymus gland, they actually, in fetal monkeys, I think they removed the thymus gland to see what happens, if that particular gland is removed. And unfortunately, those fetal monkeys had a really tough time developing their immune system, and they were pretty much just sick all the time as adults, because they didn't have that chance to develop that immune system in those developing years. All right, so that's how we discovered how important the thymus gland is. Then the spleen, if you were to cut open, and dive into the spleen and look into it a little bit closer, you'll see that there's kind of this kind of pulp-like substance, and we have what's called red pulp, which is, you can see, is kind of in between these little spaces here, and then we have this white pulp. Your red pulp in your spleen is very venous, so meaning lots of different blood vessels. They have these venous sinuses that are filled with blood, and also phagocytes. Remember, your phagocytes are your cells that destroy by eating, whereas your white blood cells, or your white pulp, I should say, in this area contains our lymphocytes. So that's just how the spleen is divided up. But as far as what the spleen does, the spleen is important in that it is going to also act as an added filter for us. Our spleen helps us to store extra blood. We know that our red bone marrow is producing blood for us, pretty actively when we need it. But our spleen is going to help to store that. When we have it acts as a storage reservoir for that blood. So it stores red blood cells and platelets. And in that process, if we have red blood cells that are expiring, it helps to remove. So our spleen acts as that filter, helps to remove any old red blood cells. If you remember, we talked about how a red blood cell only has a lifespan of about 180 days, and after that it expires. So it's going to remove those, in that process. So our spleen acts as another filter. Our spleen is one organ that some people may or may not have. It is an organ that we can live without. In the event that an organ is removed, other organs have a tendency to recognize that. And so things like our red bone marrow will just kind of actively be producing red blood cells as we need it. It is just a storage reservoir. We also have the liver and lymph nodes that will help to remove old red blood cells and toxins and pathogens as we need it. But the spleen is very helpful in that process should we still have our spleen, but if we don't, it is an organ that we can live without. But that's what it does. And then we have our tonsils. So we're going to specifically talk about some more tonsils today, but this shows you we have our pharyngeal tonsils and we have our palatine tonsils. And we'll talk about a couple of these. We're actually going to label, and then our lingual tonsils behind the tongue. We're going to label these two tonsils in our respiratory tract today. That our palatine tonsils are often the target of a tonsillectomy. You can see when these guys become swollen, that's what happens, is sometimes they will close off our breathing passageway, and we don't want that to happen. Our pharyngeal tonsils are sometimes referred to as our adenoids, and that's how we'll label those today. And then we have our lingual tonsils right behind the tongue. All of these, again, are just masses of lymphatic tissue that as we are ingesting things and as we are breathing things in through our nose and our mouth, any pathogens are going to run past these, these tissues, and we're going to try to defend our, and get rid of those pathogens right away. All right, guys, so that is the end of chapter 20. Like I said, short and sweet, but this just kind of dives right into our immune system, which we'll talk about in chapter 21. So you guys can go ahead and move on to that video now.